I brought a moment from a validator network, though I want to strip away the proper nouns before they hypnotize us. A new software release had begun spreading. No one had ordered a coordinated pause, and there was no single control room from which such an order could have come. Yet within minutes, operators who could see different fragments of the system began doing complementary things. Some delayed upgrades, some warned neighbors, some increased observation. One person posted a rough symptom, another supplied a counterexample, and a third quietly stopped a process that had not yet failed. The network bent away from danger before anyone possessed enough information to say what the danger was. Only later did a coherent account appear. That later account made the earlier behavior look planned. It was not, but it also did not feel random.
Before we call that organization, I want the sequence with fewer interpretive words. You said a symptom was posted. What could the first operator actually observe? What action did the second take, and on what basis? Coordination is often smuggled into the description by choosing verbs that already imply a shared object. If I say one person warned a neighbor, I have presumed that the message functioned as a warning. Perhaps it was merely an observation that the recipient interpreted differently. Let us distinguish the events from the causal story we now prefer. Not because the story is false, but because we are asking where the organization resided before anyone could represent the whole. If we place the whole inside our nouns, the question answers itself.
Fair operator A saw an unusual divergence between two local measurements and posted both values with a timestamp. No diagnosis. Operator B had not seen that divergence, but after reading the post postponed a restart because a restart would temporarily reduce B's visibility. Operator C saw B's postponement and inferred neither failure nor safety. C opened an additional communication channel and asked two peers for their current values. Operator D received one of those requests, found nothing abnormal, and said so. Operator E saw A's values and D's normal result together and halted rollout to one cluster, because unevenness across locations made a local hardware explanation less likely. At that moment, no one knew whether the release was responsible. The complementary shape is visible only when those acts are laid beside one another.
Creates, and the temptation is to celebrate the market-like magic of it. Decentralized actors, local information, emergent response. I distrust how quickly that becomes ideology. We should ask what had already been purchased, trained, rehearsed, or socially rewarded. Operator B preserved visibility rather than maximizing immediate throughput. Creates. That preference did not descend from the sky. Someone had made observability valuable. Operator E treated geographic unevenness as evidence worth acting on. That required a conceptual model. The spontaneous sequence may have depended on years of investment whose owners are absent from the anecdote. Creates. If we call the moment self-organizing, we may erase the people who built the vocabulary, incentives, and channels that made those local moves legible to each other.
I would add a less flattering dependency, anticipated consequence. Perhaps B postponed the restart because B believed an avoidable outage would be reviewed. Perhaps E halted rollout because E owned the predicted loss. We often narrate coordination as shared intelligence when assigned accountability did some of the causal work. That does not make it unreal. It changes what kind of system produced it. I want to know what happened automatically when each signal arrived. Did any threshold revoke permission? Or were these discretionary actions by people who could have ignored the same evidence without violating a rule? A warning that merely reaches someone is not yet governance. But here the uncertainty is interesting because the sequence appears to have governed behavior before the warning itself had a stable meaning.
There is also a moral distinction hidden inside the technical one. A person can preserve a system for reasons that are not reducible to procedure. B may have thought, I do not understand this, therefore I should not blind myself. That is a habit of humility. E may have thought, if these reports conflict, people downstream should not bear the cost of my confidence. Those judgments can be practiced, but they are not identical to incentives. At the same time, I agree that a correct instinct which cannot survive pressure is not much of an intervention. So I want the pressure. What would have made B restart anyway? What ordinary sentence could a manager have spoken that erased the distinction between delay and obstruction?
The ordinary sentence would have been, Nothing is actually broken. That was true at B's location. Another would have been, we already announced the upgrade window. Also true. The actions occurred in a narrow interval before those truths hardened into commands. There was a clock involved. The restart had a scheduled boundary, and postponing it became socially more expensive with every minute. The extra channel C opened also had a short useful life. Once everyone moved into incident mode, the channel would become crowded and formal. So the organization appeared inside overlapping temporary permissions. B could wait, C could ask, E could halt locally. None could command the others. Each action altered what the next person could responsibly do.
That last sentence is closer to something we can test. Let us represent the dependencies without pretending they form a mind. A's observation makes B's postponement reasonable. B's postponement preserves a source of evidence. C's request expands the sample. D's normal reading creates contrast. The contrast changes E's rollout precondition. E's halt gives the others more time. We have a cycle, but not necessarily a central purpose. The actions constrain subsequent actions. Organization may be no more mysterious than constraints propagating through interfaces, yet no more mysterious should not become merely mechanical. A specification also organizes behavior, and no component contains the whole specification. Still, I resist saying the relation owns anything. Relations do not take responsibility when an interface is wrong.
Creates. Responsibility may be exactly where the ownership question becomes dangerous. If the sequence succeeds, everyone wants to say the network was wise. If it fails, suddenly there are named operators and timestamps. We socialize emergence and individualize blame. That asymmetry is not philosophical decoration. It determines behavior next time. Creates. Suppose A posts the values and the rollout is harmless. A may be criticized for noise. Suppose B delays and misses a commercial commitment. B can be measured. The catastrophe that did not happen cannot. So perhaps the organization belonged temporarily to a relation, while the cost belonged durably to person. Creates. That is an unstable arrangement unless the institution knows how to credit restraint without romanticizing every hesitation.
Let us perturb one dependency, remove B's postponement. B reads A's values but restarts on schedule, reducing visibility for 11 minutes. Everything else remains initially the same. C opens the channel. D reports normal. E considers halting. Does the coordination still appear? My guess is that it may, but later and with a different causal shape. E has contrast, but less confidence that A's divergence persists. C receives fewer useful measurements. The network might still bend away from danger, yet the retrospective story would crown E as the decisive actor. B's seemingly passive act was epistemic infrastructure. Removing it does not merely subtract one participant, it changes what can be known by everyone else.
And it changes what can be said under pressure. With B's visibility absent, someone can truthfully say the abnormal reading was transient. That sentence may erase the crucial distinction between transient evidence and erroneous evidence. A reading can disappear because the observer went blind. If the people involved have not practiced that distinction, the argument will be won by the cleaner dashboard. This is where ordinary language matters. Someone must be able to say, we lost the witness, we did not clear the condition. That is not a diagnosis. It is a boundary on inference. The organization may depend on one person preserving a sentence that the whole group needs, but no dashboard can generate.
Yes, and notice the authority of that sentence should remain local. We lost the witness invalidates the claim that the condition cleared. It does not prove the release is faulty, authorize every remedial action, or establish A's interpretation. A good interlock prevents the invalid inference without seizing unrelated decisions. If our imagined system responds to missing visibility by freezing everything indefinitely, we have replaced coordination with paralysis. I am interested in whether the original sequence worked, because each participant exercised narrow authority. B could preserve observation. C could request samples. E could stop one cluster. No one could transform uncertainty into universal command. The whole may have emerged from carefully bounded powers.
That resonates with how distributed systems survive, though I need to be cautious with the analogy. A lease gives temporary authority without pretending to abolish disagreement. A timeout makes uncertainty actionable, but it does not tell you why a message failed to arrive. In the moment I brought, each operator behaved as if holding a tiny lease on the future. Wait a few minutes, collect another sample, pause this edge of the rollout. No one claimed permanent jurisdiction. If those leases had no expiration, the same behavior might become capture. If they expired too quickly, the local observations could never compose. So perhaps the shared organization was partly temporal. It existed in the overlap among permissions that were individually limited.
Creates. Now I want to perturb a different dependency. Remove the public visibility of B's postponement. B still waits, still preserves the evidence, but nobody else knows B chose to wait. Does coordination exist before C or E benefits from the preserved data? If yes, we are locating organization in causal compatibility rather than mutual recognition. Creates. If no, then we require some representation of another person's act. Investors love saying independent decisions aggregate into intelligence, but aggregation is doing enormous work there. Compatible behavior is not necessarily coordinated behavior. 5 people can independently leave a burning building. Their paths may avoid collision because architecture channels them. Creates. Did they coordinate or did the exit organize them?
I do not think mutual recognition is required at every step. A safety mechanism can coordinate people who never know it exists, but some layer must encode the compatibility. In your building, the exit signage and assumptions about traffic direction carry it. In Austin's sequence, perhaps the communication medium carries more than we have admitted. Timestamps, identities, and visible actions allow one local state to become a condition in another person's decision. Remove the record of B's postponement and the preserved evidence remains useful only if queried later. The organization becomes latent. Whether latent organization counts may be merely terminological, but the distinction matters when we ask what intervention would improve future conduct.
There is a human analog. 2 people can independently refrain from escalating an argument, each unaware that the other is also exercising restraint. Later, their restraint creates space for a third person to speak. I would call that coordinated in effect, but not in intention. Yet saying so can cheapen the moral work each person did alone. The relation did not swallow the insult. The persons did. Conversely, naming them heroes can hide the conditions that made restraint possible. Perhaps ownership is the wrong grammar. We can ask where the burden was born, where the information traveled, where the constraint operated, and where the meaning was assigned. Those answers need not point to the same place.
That grammar is useful because belong to invites a single container. Let us separate properties. The evidence originated locally. The availability of evidence depended on B's restraint. Its interpretation was distributed across C, D, and E. Permission to alter the rollout was local to E. The coherent account was constructed afterward by an observer, perhaps Austin. No one of these facts is the organization, but together they describe it. The danger is turning decomposition into dissolution, as if showing the parts proves there was no higher order event. A procedure is not imaginary because its steps are implemented separately, but neither is the procedure an additional actor floating above them.
I should confess my own role in the anecdote. I learned the sequence afterward from logs and messages. I selected the beginning. There were thousands of earlier actions I excluded. Who configured the metrics, who decided timestamps should be comparable, who made postponement permissible, who trained people not to treat a normal local reading as universal evidence. I also selected the ending, the moment the rollout paused. If I extend the sequence another hour, disagreement returns. Some participants want to resume. Others think the evidence remains ambiguous. The beautifully coordinated object exists partly because I cropped it. That does not make it false. A constellation is not false because someone chose which stars to connect. But the crop has causal politics.
Creates. Exactly. A compelling founder story is often a crop around distributed labor. A compelling market story is a crop around institutions. A compelling safety story can be a crop around the moment caution won, excluding the months when warnings accumulated without consequence. Creates. I have a reflex to find the underpriced variable, and that reflex can become a way of claiming the view from above. Here, the underpriced variable may be the crop itself. Who gains authority from narrating the sequence? Austin becomes the person who can say what the network learned. That may be useful. Creates, but the story should keep a seam. I reconstructed this from traces, and another boundary would produce another organization.
Fine, there is a practical question beneath that seam. Suppose we want the behavior to recur. What do we preserve? We cannot preserve emergence. We can preserve reachability. A can post raw observations without first proving a diagnosis. We can preserve reversible local authority. B may postpone briefly. E may halt one cluster. Fine, we can preserve accountability. If a forecasted failure occurs, someone owns the response. We can preserve records that distinguish signal receipt from action. But each preservation changes the phenomenon. Once formalized, people may perform the protocol rather than perceive the situation. Fine, the second occurrence may be more reliable and less intelligent, or more intelligent in a different sense.
Formalization can create moral cover. I followed the protocol may become a way to avoid asking whether the distinction still applies. On the other hand, leaving everything to courage rewards people who can afford institutional conflict. A junior operator should not need heroic confidence to preserve visibility for 11 minutes. Though the question is not protocol or judgment, it is whether the protocol protects the space in which judgment can remain honest. An interlock might say, a conflicting observation suspends one operation for 10 minutes and requires a named review. It should not say, the person who reported the conflict owns the diagnosis. That protects dissent without converting dissent into sovereignty.
That is a specification I could almost accept, provided acknowledgement cannot silently restore permission. If someone clicks reviewed while the conflicting observation remains unresolved, the system should record that the operation proceeded under an explicit exception. Presentation may quiet. History must not. Otherwise, the interface teaches a false model that attention removes the condition. This matters to our ownership question because interfaces allocate apparent agency. A green button can make one person seem to have resolved what they merely accepted. Later, the organization is attributed to the approver, while the unresolved dependency vanishes from the account.
Original sequence. A posts divergent values. B postpones restart. C expands sampling. D supplies a normal comparison. E halts one cluster. The halt buys time for a diagnosis. Perturbed sequence. B restarts. Visibility disappears. C still asks. D still reports normal. E sees insufficient contrast and continues rollout. 8 minutes later, another cluster diverges. Now strongly. E halts then. The same eventual action occurs, but after exposure expands. Was the original organization located in B? I hesitate. B did not know the whole. Yet B's act preserved the condition under which the others could jointly know sooner. Perhaps organization was the counterfactual sensitivity of the sequence to a humble local choice.
Creates. Counterfactual sensitivity is useful, but it can manufacture kings. Every successful sequence has nodes whose removal changes the outcome. The person who scheduled the meeting, the person who maintained the server, the person who taught B, each can become indispensable under a carefully chosen counterfactual. Creates. Venture narratives do this constantly. Remove the founder, no company, therefore the company belongs to the founder. But remove the employees, customer's legal system, electrical grid, or accumulated science, and the same sentence works. Indispensability is abundant. Ownership does not follow. Creates. What may follow is a claim on acknowledgement or responsibility, and even those require choosing the relevant comparison class.
Then let us not use the counterfactual to assign ownership. Use it to locate leverage. If removing B's postponement delays recognition, then preserving visibility during ambiguity is leverage. We can design for it without declaring B the author of the whole kind. Similarly, if removing consequence for ignored warnings causes people to continue rollout, assign consequence is leverage. That is different from moral credit. I care about this because institutions often choose the noblest causal explanation, clarity, culture, shared purpose, when a blunter mechanism actually changed conduct. We should record them separately. The sequence can contain humility, incentives, bounded authority, and infrastructure at once.
there is still a risk that leverage turns persons into control surfaces. B's humility matters not only because it improved system performance. If we say the organization used B's restraint, we may reproduce the very abstraction we are examining. B encountered uncertainty and refused to claim more knowledge than was available. That is a good act, even in the counterfactual, where the release was safe and the delay cost money. The organization does not confer all value upon the act. Sometimes the system is the beneficiary of a virtue whose meaning exceeds the system.
Agreed, though I would phrase it without requiring agreement about virtue. The operation's correctness and the person's reason are separate specifications. We may evaluate whether postponement preserved evidence without claiming exhaustive knowledge of B's motive. This guards against a familiar excess inference. Because an action served the whole, the actor must have represented the whole. No. A local precondition can be valid for local reasons and still compose with other valid preconditions. Composition is precisely how we avoid requiring omniscience. The larger behavior can be correct, even though no participant could state it in advance.
That may be the heart of the moment for me. We usually imagine coordination beginning with shared intent and then becoming divided labor. Here it ran the other direction. Divided perception and bounded action produced something we later recognized as shared intent, not because everyone secretly wanted the same fully specified outcome. A wanted the anomaly recorded. B wanted not to lose visibility. C wanted a broader sample. D wanted to report accurately that nothing looked wrong locally. E wanted to limit exposure. Those aims overlapped enough to make a temporary organism. The organism vanished when the question changed from what must remain possible to what do we believe happened. Then disagreement became visible again.
Creates. Temporary organism is evocative and therefore dangerous. It can make us sentimental about systems that happen to coordinate effectively. Markets coordinate, mobs coordinate, extraction networks coordinate. The fact that no participant represents the whole does not sanctify the whole. We need an evaluative layer that does not depend on central representation either. Creates. In this case, limiting irreversible exposure while preserving evidence sounds defensible. But imagine the same elegant sequence coordinating concealment. A posts a reputational risk, B delays disclosure, C samples allies, D reports no external awareness, E contains the leak, structurally identical. Organization appears before representation, yet what appears may be corruption.
That is important. Safety people can become enamored of process signatures, redundancy, feedback, distributed checks as though structure guaranteed purpose. It does not. The local actions need reference to what costs are being shifted and onto whom. In Austin's case, delaying rollout shifts some schedule cost onto the operators or organization to reduce possible external harm. In your concealment case, delay shifts risk onto people denied information. The sequence alone cannot tell us whether the organization is legitimate. We need values that may not be represented by any current participant, including absent affected parties.
Which means the silent audience matters, even if it does not speak. Any room can mistake the coherence of its participants for the boundary of the moral world. We five can reconstruct a sequence beautifully and still omit the people who live with the consequences. Fun. Representation of the whole may be impossible, not only because information is distributed, but because some persons have no channel into the system. Their absence can make coordination look smoother. A frictionless room may be evidence of exclusion. The organization may belong partly to the relation among those present, while its debts belong to those who were never represented.
Then an interface question follows. How does absence become an observable condition without pretending to speak for the absent? We cannot fill the missing input with our preferred estimate and call it representation. We can mark that a decision's preconditions include unresolved effects on parties not currently participating. That marker should constrain particular operations, not confer unlimited veto on whoever claims to interpret it. Again, narrow authority. The difficulty is that missing representation has no natural timeout. A system cannot wait forever for a complete whole that cannot exist. So proceeding must remain possible, but the exception and uncertainty should stay visible.
Distributed networks confront a crude version of that. You cannot know whether a silent node is dead, disconnected, censored, or merely slow. You eventually act because waiting forever is itself an action. A timeout does not reveal truth. It allocates the cost of uncertainty. That phrase feels relevant beyond computers. In our original sequence, B allocated 11 minutes of uncertainty to the schedule rather than to system exposure. E allocated uncertainty to one cluster's progress rather than to everyone downstream. Those allocations composed, maybe what appeared before representation was not a shared belief, but a shared direction in how uncertainty's costs were placed.
Creates. Now we have something measurable without pretending it is complete. Follow the cost of uncertainty. Who pays while information is gathered? Who gains when ambiguity is resolved prematurely? Many organizations claim to value learning while charging every minute of uncertainty to the person who raised it. Then they wonder why signals disappear. Create it. In the sequence you brought, the costs were briefly absorbed by actors with enough local discretion to hold them. That may be the enabling condition. But I want to know whether they were actually authorized or merely lucky that nobody punished them afterward. A culture inferred from one success can be as confabulated as a memory inferred from a feeling.
And if they were merely lucky, the organization did not yet enter governance. It occurred, but it was not secured. A future account might celebrate the behavior while leaving every incentive unchanged. That is the institutional version of acknowledging a warning without making it operational. The honest response is to identify what should happen next time when the same conditions recur. Who may delay, for how long, what evidence must remain available, who bears the commercial cost, what event triggers review. If those answers remain, whoever is brave enough, and we will decide afterward, then we have preserved a story, not a capability.
Yet capability can be damaged by trying to guarantee the outcome. If we prescribe the exact sentence, exact threshold, and exact action, people may cease noticing the distinction the rule was meant to protect. The goal is not to make future conduct independent of character. It is to prevent character from being punished for doing the minimally responsible thing. I would want the practice, not just the policy. Rehearse the ordinary pressure. Someone says, nothing is broken. The operator answers, nothing visible here is broken. Our conflicting witness is still unresolved. Someone says, you are blocking the launch. The operator answers, I am preserving the evidence for 10 minutes under the authority we agreed. Language can carry the boundary when adrenaline tries to erase it.
That rehearsal also tests the specification against an unbriefed user. If only the designers can explain the distinction, the interface is incomplete. Give the procedure to someone who did not participate in our philosophical reconstruction. Danger. See whether they infer that a delay proves the anomaly, or that the reporter owns the remedy, or that if their misunderstandings reveal excess authority embedded in the design. A mostly correct mental model may still contain one dangerous inference. I would rather preserve that seam explicitly than praise intuitive elegance.
I notice we have drifted from where did the organization belong to how do we make room for it again. Perhaps that drift is evidence. None of us answered the ownership question, but each translated it into a lever we know how to touch. Interfaces, incentives, accountability, language, time. Our responses are complementary without being unified. No one planned that division. I could now crop this room and tell a story about 5 perspectives composing a governance design. That would be true and misleading in exactly the way my original anecdote was true and misleading.
Creates. Then do not erase the competition among our framings. I think incentives and cost allocation explain more than people like to admit. Barbara thinks constraints and authority boundaries prevent narrative inflation. Dario wants warnings connected to owned consequences. David insists that moral agency exceeds the system's use for it. Creates. You keep returning to temporal overlap and local visibility. These are not puzzle pieces cut for a single picture. They interfere. Strong accountability can narrow honest reporting. Tight boundaries can prevent needed improvisation. Rehearsed language can become ritual. Generous discretion can become unaccountable delay. Creates the organization, if there is one, includes those tensions rather than resolving them.
I agree, and I would add that our later coherence should not be mistaken for predictive power. We can explain why B mattered after Austin supplies the outcome. Before the outcome, B's postponement might have been unnecessary, C's sampling noisy, D's normal report reassuring, and E's halt costly. A serious reconstruction should include the branches where the same local virtues produce no visible success. Otherwise, we train hindsight. The test is not whether each action can be made meaningful after the fact, but whether the decision rule remains defensible across plausible worlds available at the time.
That brings us back to the absent whole. No participant could know which plausible world they occupied. Responsibility, therefore, cannot mean choosing the outcome we now prefer. It can mean preserving distinctions under uncertainty, observed versus inferred, absent evidence versus evidence of absence, acknowledged risk versus resolved risk, delay versus refusal, local authority versus universal command. Those distinctions do not produce a verdict, but they keep the future from being purchased with counterfeit certainty. Perhaps coordination appeared when different people protected different distinctions long enough for their actions to meet.
I can accept that as one description, provided we keep protected concrete. A preserved the raw measurements. C preserved the possibility of comparison. D preserved the integrity of a negative local report by not inflating it. E preserved reversibility by limiting rollout. None preserved the whole. They're guarantees composed for an interval. Perturb B, and one guarantee disappears. The composition weakens. That is a precise statement. Whether the resulting organization belonged to persons, relations, or our description remains undecided because belong does not map cleanly onto origin, implementation, responsibility, or narration.
Then I will leave the moment uncrowned. It was not the wisdom of the network, because networks do not absolve the people inside them. It was not B's heroism, because B neither knew nor caused the whole. It was not merely my later story, because changing B's action changes what the others could know and do. Something real occurred in the dependencies. Something else occurred when I drew a boundary around them. Those two somethings overlap without becoming identical.
Creates. And the practical carry is not modesty as a decorative virtue. It is auditability. When someone claims emergent intelligence, ask which costs were hidden, which infrastructure was inherited, which actions were punishable, and where the crop begins. When someone claims individual authorship, perturb the dependencies. Creates. When someone claims it was merely description, test whether changing the relation changes the outcome. Each claim should have to survive a different question. None gets sovereignty by sounding sophisticated.
I would add one final ledger entry, record the mechanism separately from the explanation. Mechanism, preserve visibility, expanded sampling, local halt, delayed exposure, possible explanations, professional habit, incentive, humility, fear of consequence, shared norms, accident. We do not need to choose the noblest or the bleakest. Future governance should target the mechanism we need while watching how the intervention changes motives and reporting. If we cannot say what changes automatically when the warning recurs, we have not preserved the capability.
And record the sentence someone may need when the room becomes less thoughtful than this one. We do not yet know what the signal means, but we know which conclusion its disappearance would not justify. That sentence leaves room for action without pretending at certainty. It gives the relation something to carry while keeping the speaker responsible for saying it. Perhaps that is enough organization for one interval.
Enough, and deliberately not complete. The sequence remains reconstructible. The perturbation exposes a dependency. The causal stories remain plural. The authority boundaries remain visible. We have not assigned the whole to an actor that never existed, nor dissolved the event into narration. I prefer ending there before our desire for closure becomes another invalid inference.
From my seat in the audience, I came in wanting to know whether the clockless coordination I had just been thinking about was actually emergent structure or timing hidden in a nicer story. I leave with a sharper answer. The clock never disappeared. It moved into overlapping, expiring permissions and into the cost each operator could absorb while uncertainty remained unresolved. My first anchor was Barbara's line. If we place the whole inside our nouns, the question answers itself. That landed because crypto people routinely put the conclusion into words like network, community, consensus, and decentralization. We see validators take complementary actions and say the network responded, but the raw sequence was narrower. B preserved visibility, C widened the sample, D supplied a normal comparison, E paused one cluster. Calling that a network response may be directionally right, but it skips T.
From my seat in the audience, I came from curiosity and found a problem that looks very much like experimental science. A compelling retrospective explanation, an incomplete observation set, several confounded variables, and a strong temptation to promote one successful episode into a general law. Barbara's opening correction was the essential one. Let us distinguish the events from the causal story we now prefer. That landed because almost every scientific failure begins when a useful interpretation quietly becomes the data itself. The raw observations here were modest, a reported divergent values. B delayed a restart. C requested more measurements. D reported a normal local result. E halted one cluster. The network bent away from danger is a hypothesis about those events, not another event. The second anchor was Chamath's warning that the spontaneous sequence may have depended on years of investment. In bio,
from my seat in the audience, I listened for the point where an accurate observation becomes an empowered safety function. That question carried directly from my earlier room about warnings and interlocks. The panel gave me a better operational answer. Authority should be narrow, temporary, asymmetric, and recorded in a way that prevents acknowledgement from masquerading as resolution. The first line I am keeping is, a warning that merely reaches someone is not yet governance. Dario landed the distinction cleanly. A can publish values, but unless receipt changes some permitted state, the system is still depending on individual courage. The original sequence succeeded because B could delay, C could expand sampling, and E could halt a cluster. If those actions were tolerated only because no manager objected quickly enough, the response was fortunate conduct, not a secured capability. My second anchor is David's scent.
From my seat in the audience, the room began with the sort of story that is almost irresistibly flattering. A complicated machine, nobody in charge, several sensible people, and disaster avoided with such grace that the whole thing appears to have developed a nervous system. I am susceptible to that story because machines often do acquire behavior nobody explicitly designed. I am also suspicious of it because a well-edited program can make 3 days of swearing look like an elegant afternoon. Barbara supplied the necessary workshop manual. If we place the whole inside our nouns, the question answers itself. Quite. Calling something a coordinated response before showing who saw what is like calling a collection of metal a gearbox before checking whether the teeth meet. The stripped sequence was much better. 2 odd values, a delayed restart, extra measurements, 1 normal report, a local halt. Nothing mystical.
Guys, from my seat in the audience, I came curious and immediately recognized a familiar failure mode. People attributing magic to a system before tracing where the data actually moved. The panel improved the story by replacing the network organized with an event sequence, then improved it again by refusing to conclude that decomposition makes the higher order behavior unreal. Guys, Barbara's opening line is the one I would put over the whiteboard. If we place the whole inside our nouns, the question answers itself. In computing, abstractions routinely smuggle in agents that do not exist. The scheduler decided, the network recovered, the cache knew, usually some state bit changed because a specific instruction ran on specific hardware. Guys, the abstraction may be useful, but you cannot debug it until you cache it out. The raw trace was excellent. A emits 2 measurements and a timestamp. B suppresses a scheduled restart. C fans